Hello, welcome to the Petworth Dress tutorial. If you don't have the pattern already, you'll find the link in the description. We're going to start with the neck opening. Got my two centre fronts here. There should be a little notch in here. There it is. That is where we sew from. So I'm just going to fold it over 5mm and then over again 5mm. That's my centimetre seam allowance, and just stitch on the edge on both sides down to the notch. Small back tack, stitching all the way to the edge. So there we are, two front openings hemmed. Give those a press. Now we're going to do the seam at the centre front that starts below the opening. So right sides together. Pop a couple of pins in. And you can see we've got our centimetre seam allowance there. Here we go. Centimetre seam allowance, back tack at the top. Back tack at the bottom. That's our seam, just to neaten the raw edges. I'm going to use an overlocker, but you could zigzag or overcast if you have that facility on your sewing machine. Give it a press. That's it. Let's trim this little guy off here. And that's our front panel. Now for the shoulders and side seams. That's the back panel there, right side up, front panel, right side down. Putting those shoulders together, pop a pin in them. If you're worried about your fabric stretching, if you've got a nice light fabric like this, you can always put a stay stitch around all the panels, which I'd normally do a big stitch and just zoom round them all to make sure it doesn't stretch. That's it, all pinned, centimetre seam allowance as usual. Back tack, off we go. There we are, they're all sewn. Two shoulders, two side seams, centimetre seam allowance. Now we're going to overlock or zigzag to neaten the raw edges. That's it, just needs a press now and we're ready for the next stage. So now it's time for the sleeves. I'm just going to check that I've got my notches on my sleeve head so that I know which way the sleeve goes, which side I've got. Always two notches go to the back of the garment and the front has a single notch. This is the hem. I'm going to do a little pin hem, a sort of turn and turn. If you've got a rolling foot or a hemming foot, this is what I'm going to use, but if you don't have one, you can always just turn it and stitch it and turn it again and stitch it. Takes a little bit longer, but it's just as neat, really. Place that in the foot. and off we go. So pin hem both sleeve cuffs, give it a press. Okay, so next it's shirring. I'm going to stitch 4 rows of shirring along my cuff edge. So this is how I prepare my machine for shirring. The elastic goes on the bobbin. I'm going to hand wind it on. If you use your bobbin winder, it's just too tight, it doesn't like it. So hand wind, 1 full bobbin is usually enough for both sleeves, I find. So we're going to wind it on and then pop it in and pull it through any tensioners that you have on your particular model of machine. So I'm going to line up the edge of my machine foot with the edge of the hem and just stitch, and this is where the magic happens with the shirring underneath. Following that hem. And then I'm going to line it up the edge of the foot with the last row of stitching and stitch again. You should get a nice even space between your rows of shirring and a little frill on the edge of the cuff. That's 3 times and 4 times. Obviously do that on both sleeves, and that's what it looks like. Should be nice and stretchy. Now it usually comes out a little bit loose on me, yeah, so I'm going to pull up the shirring elastics. So have a quick measure of my wrist. I don't like it too tight, so 18 for me probably. And as you can see, it's way too big, so I will start pulling up, finding those elastics, pull them up evenly so that you get a nice even gather to your shirring. It just looks so much nicer. Pull them up that side, pull it all along. It should do that quite easily, just work its way along. Pull it up from the other side as well. Remeasure. What's that coming out as? Right, that's still too big, so I need a little bit more adjustment there. Great. Do the same for the other sleeve. So now it's time for the sleeve seams. Matching these hems up. You can pin or tack this if it's easier for you. We're going to stitch 1 centimetre away again, pulling all those little guys out the way so that they're included in your stitching. I usually make my stitch length quite a bit smaller for the sewing over of the shirring, just so that it traps those elastics quite securely. You can always back tack it as well if you want to be absolutely sure, so you don't get a stray shirring elastic. So that's it. You can see all these guys are caught into the stitching. Like I say, you can always stitch over them several times if you want to make sure they're really securely in there. We're going to overlock it and then give it a press. So next is the sleeve insertion. Here's my bodice. Check those notches. There should be one notch at the front, 2 notches at the back, the same as for your sleeve. So make sure that you've got your sleeve in the correct way. 1 notch, 2 notches. Join those underarm seams, match them together, turn it through and give it a pin. Then you know you've got the correct sleeve in the right armhole. So now it's a case of matching this top notch to the shoulder seam. This will make sure the balance of your sleeve is correct and that the ease that's in the head of the sleeve, the sort of extra fabric that you need to fit into the armhole, is around that top edge. Pin those bits, that's your underarm. And then pin that top bit, remembering there's a little bit of ease in there, a little bit of extra fabric that will go in beautifully when you stitch it. Always tack if it's helpful to you. Centimetre seam allowance. As you can see, there's the ease going in. It looks a bit wrinkled, but it's not actually. It's just the outside edge that's looking a bit fluted. Back tack. Here we are, that's stitched in. I'm going to overlook it, neaten up those raw edges. Looks nice and clean on the inside. Let's have a look at the outside. There we go, one sleeve in. Same process for the other sleeve. So next we're going to gather the neckline a little bit. So we need to find our notch along the neckline. There it is. There should be one on this side as well. There it is. So we're going to run some gathering threads. One 5mm away from the edge and one a centimetre away from the edge. I use the longest stitch my machine will do, which is a 5, I think. I don't back tack because obviously you need to pull them up. So I started from the notch there, working towards the centre front. Do the same for the other side. There we are, there's my 2 rows of stitching. I'm going to pull up from the bobbin side, so I find that easier. Find those 2 threads, bit of a fiddle, give them a pull, and you need to gather this up to 9 centimetres or your preferred amount. Obviously this is your dress, so let's measure and see what that works out as. Pull it up a little bit more. Perfect. Next, for the neck binding, I'm using my own homemade binding from the fabric. You could use a shop bought if you prefer. I'm going to match these shoulder seams together and fold the back so that I can find the centre back. I've got the centre of my binding there, the middle part, and I'm going to start there. I like to stitch mine onto the wrong side of the fabric first. So a centimetre seam allowance on the neck. You'll probably want to pin or tack your binding on first. Ever so slightly stretching my binding out as I'm going because it's lovely soft fabric. So repeat for the other side, so you've gone from the centre back to the neckline opening on both sides, and then we're going to trim down the seam allowance so it's not so bulky, nice and even, and then fold up the seam allowance and fold the binding over the top so I can stitch on the edge there, and that will look really neat. So here we go, I'm folding that over, stitching right on the edge. Pushing that seam allowance up into the binding. You get that nicely neatened edge with the binding over the top. Pin, tack, whatever you need to do to make this job easier for you. Obviously I've done it so many times, I just go for it these days. Now this bit I'll show you a close-up of in a minute, but I'm just tucking my seam allowance in and neatening this up, so I'm continuing my stitch for the tie. You can do this separately if you want to, but I just carried on going for this bit. And because I've made my own binding, I just made a huge long strip and found the middle and started from the middle, so I didn't need all of it, so I've just gone as far as I need to. So that's what it should look like. Now this side, I'll show you how I tucked that in. This is obviously with my binding with your shop bolt, it will be folded already, and you just close it up so it's sort of half the width that it was and stitch on the edge. You can tuck the little end bits in as well if you want to finish it off nice and neatly, or you can just back tack it across the bottom. And again, you can make the ties as long or as short as you want them. Right, tidy up all those little threads, give it a press, and that's one neck finished. Okay, the bodice is done, so now it's time to start the skirt. This is the top frill that I'm going to start with. 2 pieces to this, so it's quite straightforward. Right sides together, pin your side seams, centimetre seam allowance, okay, here we go, quick back tack, centimetre all the way down on both sides. So there it is. There's some notches that I forgot to show you earlier, so that you know you've got your top skirt, not your bottom frill. Overlock the edge or zigzag, whichever you prefer. Give it a press. And that's your top frill ready. Now I'm just going to fold the top of my frill in half and put some notches in, little snips for centre front, centre back. I'll match the side seams to the bodice, but I just want as a guide so that I get my gathering quite even. A little notch, there we go. So put the top frill aside, and now we're going to attach the bottom frill panels together. Now this is where it gets a bit tricky to show you what's going on because there's so much fabric, but we've got 3 pieces to this bottom frill. And basically you're just going to do the same thing again, where you're going to match up those notches on the seams and stitch all the 3 pieces together at the sides. There's the notches, so you know you've got the bottom frill, not the top frill. Quick pin in that one. That's 2 parts of the frill put together. This is the 3rd part, so once this one's in, it should be a big circle. So last seam to pin. Centimetre seam allowance as always, back tack and stitch. So once you've stitched all those seams together, overlock, give it a press, and that's your bottom frill ready. So now it's time for gathering threads. We're going to do the 2 rows of stitching like we did before on the bodice neckline. So one of the rows a centimetre away from the raw edge and another row 5mm away. I'm using the longest stitch length on my sewing machine again so that it's easier to pull up. You might want to use a thicker thread for gathering threads so they don't break, or some people use a zigzag stitch over dental floss, which they find to be a really good method. I'm just using this one today. Now my 2 rows of stitching. Find those notches that I had before that set for the centre front and the centre back. Then we can put it to the bodice. So here's the notch that we put in earlier. So we know that's a centre back or a centre front. I'm going to fold my bodice hem in half to find the centre back. So it's matching those side seams, finding the middle point, and I'm going to pin it to that notch in the top frill. Then I'm going to find the side seams of the bodice and the frill and pin those together, and then it will be centre front seam to the next notch, etc, etc. So then you'll have the frill evenly divided between the bodice sections, so when you pull up your gathering threads like we did before using the bobbin thread, there'll be a nice even distribution of gathers around the bodice. Again, pin or tack or whatever you need to do to make it easier, and stitch it together. A centimetre seam allowance as usual, stitching all the way around. So at this point you will have a frill, a top frill and a bodice section sewn together. So that's what you're left with. Nice gathering on that side that looks quite even, and a flat side there. We're going to overlock it, zigzag it, neaten it up. Lovely. Top frill and bodice done. Now we're going to do the bottom frill, and again this is where it gets a bit tricky to show you because there's just so much fabric, but I've put pins in, I've quartered it again. So I folded it in half and in half again so that I've got pins where my quarters are. And now I've got my top frill here, and I'm going to put those side seams together and fold it in half and put notches, as you can see there. So again, I've got a centre front and a centre back, so I've got quarters on there. So basically you should have 4 marks, 2 side seams and 2 notches on your top frill, and you should have 4 pins or marks on the top of your bottom frill that correspond. I'm just going to work along, matching a notch to a notch as we go along. Then you pull up your gathering threads like you did before so that they are relatively evenly distributed as much as you can. Give it a good pin and stitch along 1 centimetre seam allowance in. So here we go, I'm neatening the frills as I go, evening those gathering threads up. And I would just say that that bottom frill, it doesn't really matter where the seams go, but I would recommend you avoid the centre front for a seam because that's not terribly pretty if you've got a plain fabric. This fabric, you can't see the seams, so it doesn't really matter. Stitch all the way around. So take all the pins out. And you should have, again, reasonably distributed gathers. Overlock that edge. I've overlocked the hem as well because I'm going to turn that up in a minute. Nice and neatened. So that's 2 frills on. There we go, I just overlocked the edge and I'm just going to turn it the centimetre and stitch it. Nice simple straightforward hem under the machine and off we go. So that's one dress hemmed. Give it a good press and hopefully this is what you will have. Enjoy.